Welcome to the Northern Myths podcast, where we explore the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Dan Larrabee.
And I'm Luke DeWolf.
Today we have a very exciting episode for you. We are talking once again to Dr. Jackson Crawford, the resident scholar at the Center of the American West at the University of Colorado Boulder. He is the translator and editor of the version of the Poetic Edda that we read on the show. It's our favorite translation. It strikes a great balance between readability and accuracy. And last year, he released the Wanderer's Havamal, a standalone copy of his translation of the Havamal. It includes a side-by-side comparison of the English and Norse words, which is awesome if you're trying to learn how to speak and read Norse. And for those of you who don't know, the Havamal is essentially a book of Viking wisdom, which is attributed to Odin himself. And we're very excited to talk to him about his book. What else can you tell us about him, Luke?
Well, he's been on the show once before, so for an introduction to him and his work, that's a great place to start. He's also involved in a lot of other really cool projects, such as consulting on video games, and he's got a great YouTube channel. So if you want to learn more about Dr. Crawford, that's a great place. His YouTube channel is honestly it's fantastic. It's got so many great resources about Old Norse, like the language and Norse mythology and like his translation process, things like that. It's a really, really great channel. So we'll definitely link to it. Recommend you check it out. We're just super excited to have him on again. We had a really great time talking to him the first time, and honestly, I think he's one of our favorite people to talk to. So really excited to have him back on.
Absolutely. It's going to be a great discussion. We're going to be talking to him about the runes. He's actually got a series of YouTube videos that, if you want, on the runes, that if you want to check out, sort of as a foundation for this interview, that's a great idea. But we're not going to be jumping into the deep end right away. You can watch this without any problems. It'll be fine, and then just go watch that after, like to supplement it. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting conversation, I think, because as we know, the runes are an alphabet, which, nothing too special about that, but there's also some weird and mysterious things going on with them, and we're going to sort of see where those two things meet in the Havamal and in like the academic study of language. So it's going to be pretty cool.
Yeah, we're hoping to cover a lot actually about his Havamal in general, this Wanderer's Havamal, which he released while our show was on a little bit of a hiatus, and so we're excited to have him on to chat about that and really talk all about the Havamal in general, and we got some interesting questions hopefully about the runes, and then hopefully he'll be able to answer our questions, and we'll have a great talk. So. I think that's about it. And he's going to be calling in a few minutes here.
Yeah, and just before we get to the call, just a quick thing about support. The best way you can support our show is through our Patreon. You'll find the link below. And if you'd like to connect with us at all of our social media is in the description. All our social media info is in the description. As well, we'd like to do a quick shout out to Grimfrost. They are great for authentic Viking products and modern apparel inspired by Vikings and Norse mythology. They have a lot of great books as well, including the Poetic Edda, translated and edited by Jackson Crawford. All of his work is on their website. So go to grimfrost.com to join the horde. And now we have Dr. Crawford calling in, and we're going to switch to our call, and we hope you enjoy the interview.
Dr. Crawford, thank you for joining us on the show today. Hello.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
This is great. This is the second time we've spoken. The first interview that you did on our show, it went over great. One of our most popular, and it's great to have you on again.
What so what circus tricks did you have on the show that was your most popular episode?
Oh, that's funny. Well, the interviews that we do tend to be some of our most are most popular. And I mean, your kind of place in the community within Norse mythology, Norse studies in general. I mean, it seems like you're everywhere when it comes to Norse stuff these days, and especially like the announcement that came out just recently with the Assassin's Creed stuff you're doing and the God of War stuff. That stuff you're pretty mainstream on that.
Oh, I don't have anything to do with God of War, but yeah, Assassin's Creed. That's been a pretty big project for me, and a lot of time has gone into that. And those
Yeah.
people have been really good to me too.
Yeah. Oh, good. And that's coming out relatively shortly, right? Or has that already come out?
They say holidays, which I think means like November, December.
I see. That shows shows how close attention I pay to the video game scene. Actually, it's I just see it out there, but well, it's kind of nice to see though the kind of the mainstream position that kind of Norse mythology and Norse studies in general seem to be taking though, and you've had a fair bit to do with that, I think. So, do you want to maybe talk about kind of how you see the place of Norse mythology in popular culture these days?
Well, sure. I don't know that I've had that much to do with it. I have been kind of there at the margins for some of these things. I was, uh, I guess you would say, I've been in a kind of advisory role on things like Frozen, and then the American Gods TV show, and now on Assassin's Creed Valhalla. But I don't think that I've had a very central role in any of that. Maybe more on Assassin's Creed than anything else, given what they've asked me to do has been a deeper part of the game. I wish I could tell you what I meant.
I was just
What
gonna,
know what I mean?
I was just going to say is that I'm sure there are things that you can't talk about in
No.
regards to Assassin's Creed.
I really can't talk about very much at all right now. But I will say that they have been very. I mean, it's all storytelling. It's all going to be modern reimaginings of things, and you're never going to have something that's meant to be like you're time traveling to another time period. But they have shown more care about getting certain things right than any other group of people I've ever worked with. So that's been neat.
That's pretty fantastic.
Yeah, great team in Montreal. So for the past 20 years or so, it seems to me, Norse mythology and Vikings generally in popular culture have just been soaring up and have never stopped or slowed down. I mean, to me, this really starts with the Lord of the Rings movies. I don't know. That's my hypothesis, but I think that roughly when those movies are coming out, right around the turn of the millennium, people got really absorbed in that kind of mythic world and its atmosphere and tone, and also with certain aesthetic things that I think are kind of Norse-y in those stories. And of course, it makes sense because J.R.R. Tolkien is a Norse scholar, was a Norse scholar. So I think after those movies came out, people started looking for more of that feeling, and they found more of that feeling in Norse or Viking stuff. And the feeling I'm referring to, I know I'm being vague, but I think it is a vague thing, right? What is it that draws people to Norse myth? I kind of feel like it's the sense that you're rowing a boat through foggy waters and you see shadows of islands here and there, but you're only able to get to certain ones. And so you always wonder what the foggy ones are that you only see in the distance. It's that feeling of mystery, of exploration that comes from, I think, so much of it not being preserved well, but also a certain inherent storytelling skill from those early poets and saga writers that leave us wanting more, and that J.R.R. Tolkien learned how to imitate very well. So I think that's something that's a little bit different from something like Greek myth, where people feel that it's a little bit more laid out there. With Norse myth, there's always some mystery. You can't answer a question without opening, a can of more questions. And I think that really is part of what appeals to people, even while it frustrates them that there aren't answers to all the questions.
Well, and part of the reason for that, maybe just to reference part of what is kind of in the introductions to your books and things like that, you go into the timeline of what we have available to us, and the Poetic Edda, if I'm remembering correctly, the Codex Regius, that would have been written down in roughly AD 1270, if I'm remembering correctly, but the compositions would have been in kind of the centuries prior, at least some of them. That's correct, right?
Yeah, so with the Codex Regius, you have sort of three layers because the actual manuscript we have is written about 1270. We can tell from some spelling inconsistencies that it's copied from a manuscript that's a little bit older from about 1200. And then from certain language characteristics, we can tell that a lot of the poems are composed in the 900s or even the 800s. So the example that I use with English speakers, there's a couple examples you can use. One is if you think about reciting sonnets by Shakespeare, he rhymes love and prove. So if I recite a sonnet by Shakespeare to you, you're going to hear couplets where love and prove are supposed to rhyme. But the way that I'm speaking now, I can't make them, I could say like Louvre and prove or something and try to make them rhyme, but it sounds sort of artificial and weird. But if I'm a 2020 poet, I'm never going to rhyme those words because nobody says them to rhyme. But you can tell that I'm preserving an older poem because at one time this did rhyme, right? I'm not making that up in 2020. Or another example is "Till Death Do Us Part." That means nothing to people now, except that it's part of a formula they recite on wedding days. It means "until death parts us," but it's preserved from an earlier stage of the language because of its use in a particular repeated formula over the generations. And so there's a lot of "till death do us parts" and a lot of "love and prove" rhyming in the Poetic Edda, as it were, that show us that these poems actually do come from an earlier time than the century that they're written down in.
And then them coming just slightly earlier would also be an indication that they are a reflection of the worldview and a cultural what's the word I'm looking for, like cultural milieu that is prior to Christianity coming in and things like that. Is that your take on it?
Yes, there are poems in the Poetic Edda that are later. For instance, some of the heroic poems are probably composed as late as the 1100s. So you do have a mixture of time periods there. I wouldn't say that any of the poems about gods are conclusively that old, but there is pretty clearly pre-Christian content here, right? I mean, we're not talking about Christian figures at all, and in nowhere in the Poetic Edda, at least in the Codex Regius poems, is there a trace of mention of Christianity, which is astonishing when you look at something like the Old English corpus, right? In Old English, you're always just you're a gold panner, just trying to find the little bits of paganism in a heavily Christianized body of work. But with the Poetic Edda, who knows what may be left out? I mean, that's something we can't control for. But there's nothing added to it that looks obviously Christian, which is amazing when you consider that the time that it's written down is as far from the Christianization of Iceland as we are right now from the Lewis and Clark expedition. Somehow over generations and generations and generations, people pass this down pretty faithfully.
That is wild to think about.
Yeah, and we don't do anything like that now. I mean, of course, we have a largely literate society, so people have been printing books for centuries now, and that's one way that stuff stays the same. So we don't and now of course we have the internet, so you can just copy anything and just send it across the world. But at a time before there's even the printing press, I mean, people did practice the art of oral recitation in a very serious way, and we just don't do it at all anymore. We just have no practice at it. But I think that you can see something like it happening in a very small scale just when somebody learns the words to their favorite song, right? I mean, very rarely do you see people make a lot of effort at it. But, you listen to a song a few times and you can recite it probably pretty well. And somebody who's probably never read the lyrics can still correct you and say, no, they're actually saying, whatever instead of whatever in this particular line. And you say, oh, yeah, I think that is what he's saying. Variants can grow up that way, but people will still correct each other about it. And so you kind of have the system where, yeah, variants emerge, but they also kind of reconverge and probably are doing this over time. Still, you have one coherent tradition that, based on, again, some of the linguistic criteria, actually goes back several centuries. Hopefully that was reasonably coherent.
Definitely. That's fascinating. So I guess I've got two questions. One is about like how this would have affected your translation of the Wanderer's Havamal. And have you seen, I guess, are there earlier versions of the Havamal than the Codex Regius that you can go back to and see, differences in spellings or additions or subtractions, things like that? Like I know with the Christian Bible, there are tons of versions that you can go back through that you can see where people added things or took things out, that kind of thing. I'm just sort of wondering if there's a similar thing with the Havamal.
Well, but consider the Christian Bible is copied for 2,000 years in hundreds of different communities, right? With Havamal, we have one copy. And even the later copies that are made by hand are made from that one original copy. So we have one version of Havamal, and that's the one in the Codex Regius, the Poetic Edda. There are later handwritten copies from the very late medieval period and the early modern period, but none of them have independent value because they're all just copies of that one manuscript. There used to be a notion that one printing that I think was made in like the 1600s had actually possibly come from another medieval manuscript. But now we think that actually is just someone was actually modifying the Codex Regius text already. So with Havamal, it's actually kind of a problem that you just have one text, because there's stanzas where we can tell something's wrong, where grammatically just something doesn't quite make sense. And probably that's not originally what the stanza said, because originally the stanza probably made sense. And we don't have anything to bounce it off of, right? There's the famous early English printing of the Bible where it said, "Thou shalt commit adultery," right? But people knew because there are other versions of the Bible that actually said, "Thou shalt not." But we don't have that with Havamal. So it's just possible that there's stanzas where we actually have something completely wrong and we don't even know it. But at the same time, there's interesting little things like how there's two stanzas, and I'd have to look at the text to remind myself. But there's two stanzas, I think they're around stanza 60, where the scribe copied these two stanzas and then wrote a medieval symbol that means flip these two. It's a little triangle of dots above the first letters, and the stanzas means flip their order.
Huh.
And so that's interesting because the stanzas don't tell one story, right? You can read any stanza of Havamal, at least in the first part, Gestafilter, the first 80 stanzas. They're all kind of like independent little proverbs. It's interesting that he had a notion that they actually did come in a particular order, right? So there's something that's enforcing that idea, right? Has this person always heard them in that order, or read them in that order, or something like that? Like, why? What tradition lies behind that correction? It says that there's something there beyond just somebody encountering this manuscript kind of whatever they're copying from, whether it be a manuscript or oral tradition, kind of naively. There's something correcting, quote unquote, that transmission. And we know that Snorri knew Havamal because he quotes stanza 1 in the Prose Edda. Actually, he quotes it in a slightly different wording, which also kind of shows you this is floating around in the community. It's not just one place where this text exists or this poem exists. And there's a saga where one stanza is quoted, or a couple lines from one stanza is quoted, but it's definitely Havamal. And then you have the poem Håkonarmal, about the Norwegian king Håkon the Good and his death, which ends with some lines that are also in the famous stanza 76 and 77. And that's a poem we can pretty confidently date to 961, to the actual death of Håkon the Good. So this poem is out there, or parts of it are out there floating around. There is some community tradition about it. It's not just something that's being passed entirely in a cloister from one person to another. But we don't see that transmission, right? We just have this one text. And although it does have some pretty archaic features here and there, there's places where the language is definitely the language of Viking Age Norway and not of 1200s Iceland. I don't personally feel the right, if you will, to archaize it more than it is. I don't feel that I am privileged to deal with a text that isn't actually preserved in writing somewhere. So I'm pretty careful not to say, well, this really should say this, but to actually show you what it does say, And then what's nice about the Wanderer's Havamal as opposed to my previous two books is I have a commentary in it, so I can say, yeah, we don't know what this means. Right. Yeah. Yeah, this is kind of confusing. But that's what it says. Right. And I'd rather show you what it says than try to reconstruct, some Ur text, which I just don't think is a particularly profitable endeavor.
No, that's fair, and I think that's a good segue into, since you brought up the Wanderer's Havamal there. Can you tell us a little bit about why, compared to, you already had the Havamal in your Poetic Edda, what was the main reason to create a standalone Havamal?
That's an interesting question because I haven't asked that since I first started working on it, so I haven't thought about that for a while. But reaching back in my memory, this book actually was a pretty kind of a surprise even to me. My publisher and I have both received a lot of requests over time for the Old Norse text in the Poetic Edda, and I had always said, I just don't know. That's a lot of work to produce an edited Old Norse text, and not that many people can read it. And then my publisher was reluctant about it because you end up with pretty high page count if you have the Old Norse and the English. But so many people had requested it that we decided that it might be worthwhile to experiment with doing it poem by poem. And the natural place to do that was with Havamal, which is a text I've had a long relationship with. I had already reported to my publisher that I was considering redoing some of the translations of certain stanzas that I'd thought about over time. And I thought, too, that it'd be nice to be able to explain some of those changes. And eventually that just sort of coalesced. I think it was in February 2019. My editor and I were talking, and we decided, well, let's try this. Let's release Havamal on its own, Old Norse and English, with some commentary and see what people think. So over the next several months, I'd already done some of this work kind of on my own, just thinking about how I would redo certain things. I couldn't have done this with any poem but Havamal because I thought about it so much. But I just worked my fingers to the bone, just I probably read Havamal a few hundred times. And that was released, I guess it was finished in July and then released in November 2019. And so we have a notion that maybe we could do this with other poems if this does well. I don't actually know how well it's done. I don't really have a sense of how many copies it sold or what people think of it. But if it does end up doing fairly well, we might end up doing something like Wanderer's Völuspá, right? Kind of doing a series like this.
Yeah, I was going to say the only other one that immediately jumps to mind would be Völuspá, but the Havamal, great place to kind of start on this, and the additions in the Wanderer's Havamal are great. I especially actually, just to start off with, I really liked the additional stuff that you kind of did in the introduction, even just the additional context there. I was even thinking to myself as I was kind of rereading all this, knowing you were going to be coming back on and all that, I was thinking to myself, when is like the Jackson Crawford big book on Norse mythology going to come out? Because your writing in your introduction is so good, and it explains everything so clearly. I figured that would be something that there would be a market for one day.
Thank you. Yeah, that's something we've talked about, my publisher and I, and the Great Courses class in Norse mythology will be something like that, right? That'll be 24 30-minute lectures. It's organized like a class, so that'll be like a big, if not big book of, like a big class of Norse mythology. Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that about the introduction. One of the things I actually worked particularly hard on with the introduction was trying to convey information about the poetry itself. And there's no part of the introduction that I poured more weeks into than trying to explain Norse poetry in English, because I really hadn't seen it done before, right? People don't talk about this in a very clear way. And to find some of this information, you have to the books on this are mostly like 18th century, or not 18th century, like 19th century German and Scandinavian books that all use different terms for everything. And you're just kind of like, how do I explain this in a way that doesn't just make people give up? But that was something that I really poured myself into, was trying to explain that so that you could look at the poetry in the Old Norse and appreciate what it is that the poets are going for qua poetry.
No, and it's obvious that the time and effort you put in there, because the explanations are really quite clear. And I think what you're doing with that is really just making all this stuff so much more accessible, because even before we started our show, we were looking for the most readable translation of the Poetic Edda that was also reasonably accurate and obviously accurate, because of course there's some that take a little bit more liberty, especially some of the older versions that are in the public domain now, things like that, and those are more archaic too. But your Edda seems to really strike that balance between readability and accuracy, which I know from your notes and then our first interview, even just what was something that was really a priority to you there was making sure it was accessible.
Yeah, because the original translation of the Poetic Edda grew out of teaching Norse mythology at UCLA, going on a decade ago now. Because when I would assign translations of the Poetic Edda to students, I would have to spend so much time explaining the English that they had read that I wasn't spending any time explaining Tibetan. So I thought, let me just take all this dressing off of it and just put it into English that you can read on a bus, right? And there's decisions there. You're always going to make editorial decisions. One thing that we decided was not to have anything like footnotes or endnotes, because we thought that would detract from people just reading them as stories, which is what they're meant to be. One thing with the Wanderer's Hawkmall or the Peninsula Wanderers series that I get to go back and do is add notes and explain why I did something in particular. Because, of course, somebody who doesn't know Old Norse or who hasn't talked to me about some particular stanza might look at some particular stanza and say, well, this is wrong. Because it's different from Bellows or Hollander or maybe even Larrington. And I didn't have anywhere to explain that. Right. So that's something that's maybe lacking there is some places where I could have said, oh, and by the way, the reason I did this differently from everybody else is because, read X article from 2013 that nobody else had ever had access to. But I still think that I more or less achieved my goal of making a reasonably readable translation that does not do injustice to the original. I still feel pretty okay about that.
Yeah, I think we would definitely agree with that. Sort of in that vein, one of the parts in the Havamal that we like the best, because it's weird, is Odin finding the runes and the rune spells. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I know, like, if we were to Google it right now, we'd be able to find all sorts of like rune magic stuff. I would, woo. But I'm very curious about like the real academic understanding of that part. One, Odin sacrificing himself to himself, but also the different rune poems, like knowing the rune for help and how to blunt your enemy's swords, that kind of thing.
Well, so I'll start with the second half of that, which is the spells. Actually, so those 18 spells that he says he knows, and of course he doesn't tell us what the 18th is, but he does describe the other 17, don't explicitly have anything to do with runes. There's one where he says that if someone carves a curse in runes, he can reverse it. Right, but otherwise they're not explicitly associated with runes. They're called Yov, which means song. So they may not actually have to do with runes. Those spells have, of course, had a lot of ink spilled over them. One thing that I've always kind of wondered, and I can't say that this is true or not, it's pure speculation. I've always wondered if there might have been a stage of Havamal where the actual words of those spells might have been part of it. Right, at least the first 17, because it's always struck me that he brags when he gets to the 18th that he's not going to tell us that spell. And I've always thought, well, you didn't tell us the other 17.
Right.
So was there a time when this was actually transmitted with the spells that would be something you'd expect might be lost over time, because we've seen in all over Norse mythology that this Christian scribes copying these stories are willing to copy stories. They're not willing to copy prayers, rituals, things like that. And so they might resist copying the words of spells. I've always wondered, but there's no way to prove it one way or the other.
Yeah, the
Um,
only spell extant that's in Sigrid from all, right? In the Poetic Edda, the sort of the Hail Day thing.
Yeah. So we speculate that could actually be a pre-Christian prayer. The problem with that, so even linguistically, the word there's nothing in it to say this is really old or this is really young. Right? It's something that works pretty well at any stage of the Old Norse language. So it's just there's nothing there that really helps you get a finger on it and say, yeah, this is old or it's not. If it is old, then that would be one of the very few prayers that we have preserved. But we do have spells preserved. Most of the spells are in fairly late books, the so-called Galdrböcker, books of spells. None of those are older than the pretty late Middle Ages, so we don't know if those are really part of like a continuous Norse tradition or how much of that is sort of adapted from continental European models. And a lot of it we know is adapted from continental European models, so I'm not so sure that all that reflects the same tradition as in Hávamál, although plenty of people on the internet are. As to Odin sacrificing himself to himself, yeah, that has been one of the great mysteries. It is clearly an old tradition that Odin is associated with sacrifice, both by spearing and by hanging. Of course, there's the famous scene in Gethreg's saga, which I include in a later part of the Wanderer's Hávamál, a translation of the scene, where King Vikar is sacrificed by hanging and being speared. He's sacrificed to Odin in that fashion. So it seems pretty clear that Odin is sacrificing himself in the same fashion that he would expect perhaps a human to be sacrificed to him in. That's pretty striking. Of course, people have seen parallels with the Christian crucifixion. It's not lost on people that Christ also was hanged in a certain sense. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but he is hanging sort of from a cross. Even you could potentially say from a tree, sort of, if you think of a cross that way. The length of time is different. The number 9, Odin says he hangs for 9 nights, and of course 9 is a significant number in Old Norse, but also in Norse poetry, alliteration is important, and niu natter, 9 nights, alliterates.
Right.
Now, there's a famous, famous as much of any of this stuff is famous. There's a Shetland folk song, I think, collected in the late 1700s, early 1800s, where the crucifixion of Christ is described in terms that are pretty similar to actually what Odin says about himself in Hávamál, where it's said that Christ hung for 9 long nights, very similar wording to Hávamál, that he was bitten by the rime, right? So that sounds more like a cold Scandinavian environment than like a Middle Eastern environment. So people have wondered if that actually represents the Hávamál story kind of leaking in and influencing the Christian story. I tend to doubt that originally the stories have anything to do with each other. I think it's more of a coincidence of motif, right? I mean, the god being sacrificed, and there are people who would call this a sort of heretical reading, even kind of being sacrificed to himself. You can kind of see Christ in that sense. Is a powerful image, right? I mean, sacrificed gods occur all over the world. We see them in Aztec mythology. We see them in Babylonian mythology, kind of in Greek mythology. If you think of Prometheus as kind of a sacrifice, it's a powerful motif that pulls at the mind, I think. And Odin's association with the spear is probably much older than any Scandinavian's awareness of Christ being speared on the cross. Anyway, that's something people wonder about. One of the questions that I think doesn't get asked enough is, what tree is Odin on? He doesn't actually say he's on Yggdrasil. Yes, that's a tempting inference, but it doesn't say that anywhere. People have wondered if the name of the tree, Yggdrasil, has something to do with the story. It is a really weird, mysterious name. Drasil is a poetic word for horse, which, why is a tree named horse? And then Ygr is well known as one of Odin's names. He uses it all the time. It means frightener. So what Yggdrasil is that Odin's horse. So is the tree called Odin's horse because he rode it, right? This is some gallows humor, which the Norse are well known for. because Odin rode the tree. Is that his horse? Well, maybe, but then why isn't it Yggdrasil? Why isn't it his tree? Why is it Odin tree? Yggdrasil. There's no possessive there. So there's a lot of speculation about this. One of the most recent ideas that I think is kind of neat is by Anatoly Lieberman, who thinks that actually Yggdrasil is originally the name of Sleipnir, Odin's horse.
So if he's Sleipnir, if Yggdrasil is Sleipnir, then have we essentially gotten this entire thing wrong, or like maybe the name was transferred to the world tree at some point? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, he thinks it actually gets transferred to the tree. Because mostly the tree is actually called Yggdrasils askr. It's mostly called the ash tree of Yggdrasil.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
Right. So he thinks that maybe originally Yggdrasil is a term for either Sleipnir or Odin and Sleipnir regarded as kind of a unit. The Freidner horse Yggdrasil, and that only later does this even come to be understood as the tree itself, because Oscar can also be used. Okay, I'm telling only part of the story, and it's kind of a convoluted story. But
That's
Oscar,
okay.
so Oscar's also the original name of it's also the first human being.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So it's used all the time in poetry to mean man. So to do more justice to Anatoly, what he's saying is Yggdrasil's Oscar is actually originally Odin. He's the man of the tree of the horse of Odin.
Okay.
But people then misunderstand Oscar to mean literally tree. And so they apply it to the ash tree, which is the tree that connects the various worlds. And so then the name goes from being the name of Sleipnir to being the name of the tree, which isn't originally named Yggdrasil. I think that's fairly persuasive. It's certainly different. I kind of appreciate, a fresh argument about this. At any rate, it's not clear that Odin is sacrificing himself on that tree. But unfortunately, we only have this story told in Hallmal. It's not mentioned anywhere else that Odin hanged himself on this tree. Now, he is called the Hanged God a lot, or or just Hungy, Hangy, like hanging guy. But nowhere else is the actual story hinted at, so we don't have any clarification about his relationship with that tree or with whatever tree this is. It could also be in Grimnismal. He talks about in great detail a tree called Læralder, which is in Valhall. Right, could be that tree. That tree could also be Yggdrasil. Right, there's so many things here where we don't even know how all this is connected.
Okay, so I'm going in a few different directions here when you talk about something like this. First would maybe be, what do you see necessarily the significance of kind of the name Yggdrasil being the primary one that we have for what refers to this world tree, or at least apparently to this world tree? If that doesn't come from the same original root, if that's not, that would generally it'd be a kenning, right, for the world tree. Is that how you would describe that? Maybe I'll pause there to let you answer.
Yeah, so the sequence would be, again, and hopefully I'm doing justice to Anatoly's idea here. Originally, Yggdrasil is the horse. It actually is the horse. And so Yggdrasil's ash means Odin, because ash is a kinning for man. So Yggdrasil's ash would be Sleipnir's man, so Odin. Somewhere along the line, ash is actually taken to literally mean an ash tree. So the name is transferred to the tree. That's the sequence. It goes from horse to sort of meaning Odin to meaning the tree.
And the significance here in terms of maybe popular conception would be that then the name is not necessarily referring to this specific story. Is that kind of what you're getting at there?
Yeah. Thank you for actually bringing me back to why we were talking about this. Yeah. So people have seen actually the name of the tree. If it means something like Odin's horse is like a jokey way of saying this is the thing he rode, like he hung on, then it's evidence that he actually was hanging from Yggdrasil. But the name doesn't actually necessarily suggest that, is what I'm saying. Right. So we just cannot say for sure what tree Odin hanged himself from. And I like to make that clear because I like to make clear how many things we assume. Right. Yeah, I assume things too. But because I'm outside a little bit of the sort of popular culture of this stuff, I can kind of look inside and see what people are assuming. And I like to kind of remind people, it actually doesn't necessarily say that exact thing. And maybe pointing that out, maybe down the line, someone years or decades hence who's a lot smarter than me will notice some hint in there and say, oh, it's actually this other tree that makes a lot more sense, and this will become part of the new canon understanding in Norse myth. You don't know how this stuff is going to go.
Well, first of all, reducing assumptions, that's something that we appreciate, especially because we are trying to find what this stuff is actually telling us beyond the literal. Now, in terms of kind of the significance of what this would mean, I've got two thoughts. What would be the significance of it if it says some other tree? And then from kind of a symbolic standpoint, is there necessarily a huge difference if it's the world tree versus some specific tree? Those are the places my mind is taking me. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I don't know what the significance would, to tackle your second question first. I don't know that it makes much of a difference, and I certainly understand the poetry of him sacrificing himself on the tree that connects the various worlds. I get that as a nice poetic image. If the tree that's in Valhall is actually a separate tree, that might also tell a slightly different story, right? He's sort of sacrificing himself at home, right? I think here's a parallel that I'll make that maybe makes that an interesting idea. In the saga of the Volsungs, when Odin comes into the hall of Volsung himself during the wedding of Signy to Siggeir, he sticks a sword into the tree that stands in the middle of Volsung's hall. If Lærother, which he mentions in Grimnismal, is a tree that's in the middle of Valhall in the same way, then if that's the tree he's hanging from, he's hanging himself in his own home from a sort of central place in that house. It's almost like burning yourself in your own hearth or something like that. That does give it, I think, a little bit of a different image, a different feel, if you will, and maybe a different significance if it's
No, that one still reminds me actually of things like, I know there's some Central Asian stuff. I think I read this in Eliade, where the pillar in the middle of their house was essentially assimilated as well to the world pillar or world tree idea. So to my mind, that still kind of has the same significance. And I think my side point on that is that I find the poetic imagery of him being kind of on the world tree is it also underscores the significance of what he's doing, because he's actually on the symbolic world pillar which connects the sacred and the profane. So all of these images together, I think they still seem to point to the same symbolic place. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I can see what you're saying. I guess this is an unpopular position, but I'm a sort of shamanism skeptical when it comes to the Norse. I don't see that many connections between Odin's story and shamanic practices. The Norse observe shamanic practices among the Sami, and you actually read about this in some sagas, notably, for example, Vatnsdæla saga, the saga of the people of Vatnsdal. If people want to follow up on that, there's a translation of that in the Penguin Sagas of Isender's book, the one that has the Viking ship head
Perfect.
in front. So follow up on that if you want to see what I'm talking about. They do talk about some Sami rituals and describe them, and I mean, that's shamanism. I don't necessarily see the Odin story in the same light, and I think people have made a little too much of that, personally, from what I understand about shamanism among the Sami or in Siberia, or in unrelated cultures. I also think that people make a little too much about Yggdrasil. I think we have a lot of, so back when I taught at UC Berkeley, I remember I was looking at animal shelters in the area, or wildlife rehabilitation centers, and there was one called Yggdrasil. I don't mean to pick on these people, but they said in their description, Yggdrasil means the world tree in Old Norse. I thought, well, it doesn't literally mean. I mean, actually, the story of what it means would fill a 2,000-page book if you try to explain all these ideas. But it doesn't mean literally just the world tree. And it's actually never even called the world tree in Old Norse. That term, world tree, doesn't occur anywhere. And so I think we need to kind of take a step back from that term. The whole idea that it is a quote-unquote world tree comes from Grimnismal, which Snorri also kind of quotes, but he gets the idea from Grimnismal too, that it is three roots. One goes into Hell, one goes into Jotunheimr, and one, we're told, is either in Asgard or over Midgardr. So that could be the same one, right? If Osgard's kind of above us, then that's the same root. So the notion that there's roots in these different quote unquote worlds or realms, but does it quote unquote connect them? It's not. It doesn't seem to be a means of transport. It kind of is in the Marvel universe, but the only thing that's said to move on Yggdrasil is the squirrel.
Right.
Right. Tusker goes from the eagle at the top to the serpent at the bottom and transmits insults between them. But that's the only being that's said to move on it. Right. Otherwise, Yggdrasil doesn't seem to be a method of transportation. So is it connecting the worlds, or is it sort of growing up out of the different realms? Right. I think we maybe prejudice ourselves to seeing a more like networked series of realms. And I do like to use the word realm rather than world because they're not planets, right? Than I think is actually necessarily talked about in the original texts. But that's a whole can of worms. There's a great article about this. Let me see if the name, I believe it's by Eldar Haida, about how the realms are connected in Norse myth. He looks at the different ways people travel from one realm to another. He collects all the instances where somebody does and shows just how surprisingly complex it really is. Sometimes it really seems like people basically traveling between dimensions in sci-fi. Sometimes it seems like you're just sort of walking right from Asgard to Hell or something. It's really strange and kind of surreal how all these realms are connected. And Yggdrasil doesn't seem to be a big part of it in the larger body of stories about people moving from realm to realm.
Well, you know, if you get that that article, like the name or something like that, happy to.
I think it's Elder Haida. It was in, I think, Molag Mena, like 10 years ago. I can send you the specifics.
Yeah, we'll include a link in the description later. Well, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and actually, if maybe some information on the one by Anatoly as well would be
sure,
a great resource.
I don't have that on my bookshelf right now, but that's in his book, In Prayer and Laughter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. Be sure to include a reference to that as well.
Yeah, that book, that is basically, so some of that is previously published articles, and a lot, I mean, basically that book can just be summed up as Anatoly tries to answer everything, which is great because he knows so much. I mean, you read it and just there's like no problem he tries to leave unsolved. It's really great to get his many decades of experience in all these different questions.
That's awesome.
And he's at the University of Minnesota.
Okay.
I'm sure you've run into his name before.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think we've heard the name, but no, that's good to get the specific reference. We'll be sure to follow up and include the link and all that too. So
he's a cool guy. I think you'd enjoy talking to him.
Nice.
Awesome.
Appreciate the recommendation.
And so where do the runes fit into this discussion of Odin and sacrifice?
Well, he says at the end, let's see, I guess that's in stanza 139. So in stanza 138, he talks about hanging. And then in stanza 139, he says that he fell from the tree and he took the runes. So it seems that, although note that he doesn't just explicitly come out and say this, it seems that somehow by hanging himself and potentially even dying on this tree, he has learned the runes. Then for the rest of, so this is the section of Hofmal called the Runatal, or Tally of the Runes, stanzas 138 to 145. For the rest of it, we get some cryptic stanzas about runes. He talks about learning from his maternal uncle, who is not otherwise known. He talks about how he asks us questions. Do we know how to carve them? Do we know how to paint them? Do we know how to send them? Do we know how to, et cetera, et cetera? And these questions need to relate to runes somehow. And then he transitions in stanza 146 to telling us about his spells. Now, you alluded to those as being runes. Potentially, these are spells he learned from knowing runes somehow, but he also doesn't quite come out and say that. So that could be an unrelated part. And since we know that some parts of Hogmal are older than other parts, I wouldn't be totally confident that the part about him sacrificing himself necessarily originally went with the part about the 18 spells.
Oh,
It could.
interesting.
It could. Yeah. So Havamal is broken up into at least 5 different constituent poems, united by the fact that they were all spoken by Odin. I mean, it's pretty clear that he's the speaker in all of them. Even the very first part, even the sort of generic, not generic because they're great, but the universal proverbs, you can still tell it's Odin because he talks about getting drunk with Gunnlod, right? So there's still little things that give you a hint that it's Odin. But the first part, Gestatholter, the proverbs, are older in their language than the next section about his love adventures. So when he's talking about failing to seduce Billing's daughter, whoever she is, and then successfully seducing Gunnlod, that's a younger part of the poem, and it's probably not originally part of the same poem as the Wanderer's advice in the very first 80 stanzas. So we know this is sort of sewn together out of at least 5 originally separate poems, potentially 6 or 7. So I wouldn't be too surprised if, in fact, the list of spells is originally some separate thing. It could come from, some totally different context, perhaps some poem where Odin is speaking to some giant or something, and he's bragging about, hey, here's the 18 spells I know.
Which sounds like something he would do.
Yeah, no, that totally sounds like him. But also, it's kind of unusual. There's unusual things here. Not to get too into the weeds, but when he's telling the stories about seducing or trying to seduce Billing's daughter and successfully seducing Gunnlod, he's telling those stories in the meter, the Odahaldr, which is the same meter he uses in the first part for giving us proverbial advice. But it's really weird for stories to be told in that meter. I know that's a minor seeming point, but there's still something interesting going on there, that this is a meter that's usually reserved for either dialogue, 2 people are talking to each other, or for dispensing advice. For storytelling, they almost always use the meter 4 near the slaw, which is the meter of Bolaspa, the meter of Trimskvida, right? Poems that are. So why is there a story being told in the other halter? There could even be something behind that. The original context could be perhaps something unexpected. Maybe this comes from some kind of dialogue poem too, where Odin has somebody he's telling this story to. That maybe it's even Lodfafnir, the guy that he says he's talking to in the next section, Lodfafnsmall. And we have no idea who that is, right? There's all kinds of speculation about that. Anatoly has ideas about this too.
Excellent.
That's why I love Anatoly, because even when I can't think of an answer to something, like I can always say, Anatoly has an idea about this.
No, that's good to know. And maybe kind of to come back to the overall significance of Havamal, because I think in some level the production of a separate Havamal, to go in and go through the details, like why you did things a certain way, and then as well you're included Cowboy Havamal. As far as I can tell, this is a pretty darn important poem to you. What would you consider the significance of Havamal, both, I guess, for yourself, but also for us in general in this day and age?
Well, for me specifically, I like wisdom literature, right? And it's not just Havamal. I have an affection for Ecclesiastes and the Bible, Proverbs and the Bible. For Epictetus, the Greek philosopher, and his Enchiridion, which is sort of proverbial in the way it's set up, that literature appeals to me. I enjoy. I guess it may shock you, but I guess it maybe comes from a certain humility on my part, where I say, I don't have this all figured out, but people have been on this planet for a long time, and it's worth listening to the advice of the people that came before, because maybe they figured something out that I haven't yet. I like kind of putting myself in the position of saying, what can I learn from this? And what I've always loved about Havamal is that it's so clear-eyed, realistic. There's no fantasy in the wisdom in Havamal, in those first 80 stanzas especially. It's just a straight-up, clear-eyed look at the world. And it's a world where people are going to hurt you. It's a world where people are going to betray you. It's a world where you really can't rely that much on anybody else. But it doesn't. But it's not a lament about that, right? It's not about the failings of human beings. It's about how, this is just how the world is, and this is how you can operate in it intelligently. And I appreciate that. You don't need a filter to read Havamal. There's nothing where you have to say, yeah, that's kind of that doesn't really apply today. It's all very universal. It applies in any culture. It applies in any time. And I really, really appreciate that about a Havamal. And so my cowboy Havamal grows out of that feeling. This is very universal and applicable. It always sounded to me like my grandfather. Right? My grandfather was the same way. A guy who had cynical's unfair. He really wasn't a cynic, but a guy who had a very dry, clear view of people, but also wasn't prone to sit around and complain. So, this is how you make it in this world, and if you're smart about it, you can make it pretty good. And so I always kind of read Havamal in his voice, and so the cowboy Havamal is me very literally putting it in his voice, right? I mean, trying to make it sound like him as much as I can. So what I think people can get from Havamal is more or less what I get from Havamal. It's a very practical look at the world that doesn't require you to, and here's something that I think is important that people forget. I don't think Havamal is the quote unquote Viking code of ethics. I don't think Havamal is any more normal in its time than any given book you could pick up today, right? Any book published in 2020 is going to have people in 2020 who would disagree with it. And there's a lot in Havamal that I'm sure was not everyday Viking wisdom. I mean, for one thing, there's so much in there about sobriety. I mean, that's probably not a very common Viking virtue. When you compare Odin to Thor really is more the embodiment of the culture, right? He's the one, as much as Odin encourages being a Dranger by rewarding you for it with an afterlife in Valhalla, it's Thor who actually lives it, right? And Thor is also the big drinker, the big eater. He's kind of a bon vivant. He's out there really living life pretty raw. Odin is more intellectual about it, and I think that's as rare then as it is now. And I think that you can translate Havamal into Japanese, into Hebrew, into Arapaho, into ancient Egyptian, and you can translate every stanza of it into something that's virtually identical to what the Old Norse is. It's actually not that culture specific, and it's in the wisdom parts, right? I mean, the story about him like seducing, billing. Okay, there's some pretty specifically Norse stuff,
right?
But just the straight up wisdom stanzas in the first 80 stanzas are so universal, and I think it's a reminder that in every culture, there's people who live in a reflective way. And toward the end of their lives, and I mean, clearly Odin is very old. He's always portrayed as an old man. During their older years, they reflect on what they've learned and try to transmit that to a younger generation. And I think that it's a sort of an encouraging thing to notice how similar that is between different cultures. Right? I mean, human beings are the same everywhere.
Right.
No matter how you dress up the particular culture.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And it's funny you say, because our little 5-second pitch for the Havamal for someone who knows nothing about it is that it's the book of Viking wisdom attributed to Odin. But I think maybe we'll be a little more careful about that description. In terms of the idea that it was some kind of universal code of ethics or something like that. You're talking about. I think I'll be careful about that description of it in the future, because that's a really good point.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's Odin's wisdom, but is it generic quote unquote Viking wisdom? I really doubt it. Right? Again, the sobriety part is a specific example you can point to.
Well, and I think we want to still make the distinction about it's Odin's wisdom, but we're jury's out on the reality of Odin as a historical figure, something like that. Just to put that a little, he's a god. He's a mythological figure as opposed to someone such as Snorri, who we know the authorship of. So,
yeah, but I don't think it's necessary to postulate Odin as a historical figure to appreciate Odin as as the stated author of Havamal. It's meant to be. So, when you look at who is supposed to be wise in different cultures, there's some pretty common themes there. Like today, right? If I'm walking down the street and I'm contemplating some difficult decision, I'm having a real hard time, and I think I need some wisdom. I need someone who's got wisdom. Am I going to turn to the 18-year-old who's skateboarding past me? Or am I going to turn to the 80-year-old man with some scars on his face, with his 1,000-yard stare? That's the guy that I think is going to have wisdom. And that is how Odin is described, right? Odin is half blind, right? He's always described as old. He's been horribly injured, and that may be part of why he tells the story of sacrificing himself, right? He has maybe not just been close to death, he might have died on the tree, which raises all of its own issues, but he has suffered and he's very old, and that's always who we seek wisdom from. And I think that's a big part of why this is put into Odin's mouth, even though I think that different parts of the poem are older and younger, right? I think so to be a little bit more specific, I think, for example, Gestafilter, those first 80 wisdom stanzas are probably from the 900s, and they're probably specifically from Norway. There's a lot of really specific Old Norwegian vocabulary there that you don't see in Iceland much. The next section about his love adventures is probably also Norwegian, but it's probably about 100 years younger. It could be some pretty old traditional stories, but it could even have been composed as a poem after Christianization. It's noticeably younger language. So that's interesting, but it's also interesting that at some point about 200 years after that, some poet, well, not necessarily a poet, but somebody in Iceland decided all this belongs together, right? And wrote it down as one thing and called it Havamal.
That's really cool. I think this whole discussion of Havamal as this book of wisdom, I'd never thought about the kind of the implication of it being attributed to Odin like that, in the sense that really this is supposed to be the maybe the right word is archetypal wise man, something like that. And I think that really fits into what we really look for out of not just Havamal, but all of the Norse stories, mythology in general. What we really look for is what it can tell us and how it can apply to life today. And for that reason, I think Havamal really turns into this, it's not even just not quite a guidebook or something like that, but valuable wisdom at a minimum.
Yeah, and a guidebook. I mean, who could make a guidebook to all of life? But I find that it addresses so many situations. And as far as, to come back for a minute to that archetypical wisdom figure, if you today were to say, I'm going to write a novel or a TV series or something, let's say that you have a group of, I don't know, action-seeking young people from Alberta, and they decide they're going to go to Colorado and see the real mountains.
Ooh.
Well, so what figure would you make up to have them lead them on their grand expedition, right? You would probably say, well, I'm going to establish him as wise and knowing what he's talking about, and I'm going to, at minimum, probably give him like at least one scar and at least graying hair, right? It's age and it's pain that make us say that's a wise person. And Odin is quintessentially aged. I mean, he killed the first living being, and he's quintessentially hurt, right? He's missing an eye and has been probably killed when he hung on the tree.
He's experienced the suffering of the world in a way that has somehow granted him, I don't want to say that so passively, but he's gained new knowledge and wisdom in both senses of those words, something like that.
Yeah, and not to belabor the comparisons outside of Norse mythology, but I think that is actually a little bit similar to Christ. And I think that Tolkien also deliberately invokes something very like that when Gandalf dies in the first Lord of the Rings book. I guess he dies. I don't know. He comes when he
fights that fire demon thing, Balrog, I think it's called.
Yeah, right. When he ceases to be Gandalf the Grey.
And Väinämöinen in the Finnish mythology has a similar story where he gets shot off of his horse by this young upstart figure, and then he spends 7, 8, 9 years drifting in the sea. So they all have kind of these similar themes, I think.
Yeah, or look at Ecclesiastes. He starts off by talking about his long experience and all the things he's seen. We try to establish wisdom because you can't just you can't just pick an 18-year-old off the street and say, "Tell me your wisdom." That just doesn't work.
No.
You have to establish that age and that suffering. Yoda is an example of that too, right?
There you go. Yeah.
Like let's mix all of the most sacred ideas of the last 3,000 years
Yeah.
in Star Wars.
Hey, I mean, if there's a modern story that kind of encompasses this whole mythology, I think Star Wars isn't too bad.
Yeah. I mean, I'm always telling students that Star Wars is the saga of the Volsungs of today.
Oh,
and it really is.
Definitely. I see that 100%.
Yeah, because you can allude to it without even telling people you're alluding to it, right? If I started this interview by breathing like this, you'd know I was setting myself up as a bad guy. Or if I was talking to you, with a croaky voice and saying something like, listen to me, you must, right? I'd be setting myself up as a wisdom figure.
Absolutely.
And the Volsungs is that to Norse literature, but we're wandering afield.
No, but that's a good point, even to point to the things that are left unsaid in what we have in Norse mythology, especially the poetry, is that they make reference to things that aren't explained anywhere else, and the culture would have understood that, the people would have understood that, and we missed that, unfortunately, right?
Yeah, they might have understood it, but there's also the possibility that some of that is actually there to be mysterious to the original audience. Right? I mean, if you read a poem like Volspawn Skama, otherwise known as Henry Oath, there's references to stories that we have nowhere else. Like what's going on when Loki eats a burning heart that he finds on a tree,
Right.
and then birth the monster? What is that? Right? Is there a story there? That could be, but it could also be meant to make the original audience say, "Oh, because we do this today." Right? Tolkien does this in all of his storytelling. Oh, I guess he probably actually had all these stories told somewhere in his notebooks. But you can absolutely do this today to evoke a sense of mystery as you allude to something that you don't actually tell about. And that could be actually what's happening in some of these stories. Quite possibly, for instance, Odin, to bring it back to Hofmal, when he tells about sacrificing himself, maybe that story wasn't ever told more fully anywhere else. Maybe it's already composed to be a mystery. I think that's actually even plausible.
Wow.
Yeah, another interesting way of looking at it. Something to think about, that's for sure. I'm conscious of your time here, and so we don't want to keep you or anything. But was there anything else that you wanted to talk about? Something that anything you're working on that you'd like our audience to know about?
Well, I've rambled at you, and I apologize for that. But I am currently working on, my next book is actually a translation of two sagas, the saga of Herborn Haethrak and the saga of Rolf Kraki, both of which the sort of unifying feature is that they are mythical, heroic sagas that have Odin playing a major role. So that will be, those translations are done, everything is written, but coronavirus has slowed everything down.
Right.
So I don't know if that's going to be on. And I'm also contracted to produce the Prose Edda, which I've begun working on. And I'm also working on my Great Courses class in Norse mythology. And I'm still putting out somehow 2 videos a week, sometimes 3.
Actually, I noticed that you were doing like a language class on YouTube. I haven't had a chance to sit down properly and look at it, but that seemed pretty cool that you could actually maybe learn some Old Norse for free.
Yeah, thank you. I hopefully that works out okay. Actually, when I started my YouTube channel, or when I started the version of it that is out there today in 2016, it originally started with Old Norse lessons. But eventually those videos got so old, there were so many things wrong with them that I took them down. So now I'm trying it again. People ask for it, so I'm trying to answer the demand. Trying to kind of walk you through in such a way, I'm not just telling you like, here's all the nouns, here's all the verbs. I'm saying, here's the really coarse vocab, here's the really core grammar. Let's see if we can get you reading simple stuff within a few weeks and then build on that and get you reading more complicated stuff. It's kind of an experiment. My publisher and I have been talking for a long time about maybe doing an Old Norse textbook. If I do, putting something out like this kind of helps me see what works, what doesn't, what's clear, what's not. And along the way, I always find you learn best by teaching, and that's true even as something you've been teaching for a long time.
Oh, that's awesome. I hope that you do put out a textbook on that. I will definitely pick that up.
Thanks. Well, we'll see. There's a lot. Always juggling a lot of balls in the air at once.
For sure.
That's fair. It definitely sounds like that's the case. And you also are on all the social media platforms if folks want to get in touch with you, right?
Yep. I am Norse by SW, Norse by Southwest, on Twitter and I guess on Instagram, although I'm sick of Instagram right now.
No, fair enough. And you've also got your Patreon, right? If anyone wants to support you directly.
That is also Norse by Southwest, Norse by SW, and I have been very fortunate to actually have that as my primary means of supporting myself right now.
Wow.
Oh, that's great.
That's amazing. I mean, you're obviously doing so many valuable things that people are finding valuable, right? So I think that's well deserved, and we'll put links to everything in the descriptions here.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that. I mean, that's what I want. I want to make things available to the people that want them, and I want to feel like I'm doing something to kind of move the ball of teaching people about the real Norse mythology, the real Norse language, and letting people, when applicable, draw their own conclusions. But I want them to draw their own conclusions with the real facts.
Well, and that's, I think, what we found so valuable, because, I mean, what we're doing, our show primarily, it's not necessarily about us drawing our own conclusions, more about pointing out things that look like they're similar to other things or that fit certain mythological patterns and things like that. We'll be the first ones to admit that we are the furthest thing from experts, but standing on the shoulders of someone who actually has done the work is very very helpful. So we appreciate your work very much.
Well, but here's what I'll say: it doesn't belong to the experts, right? I mean, nobody owns this, and I think that it's important for people that don't want to go out and get a PhD in this, which it's very reasonable not to go out and get a PhD. To be able to approach it and understand it, right? I mean, that's what education's for, as far as I'm concerned. So I say more power to you, and thanks for doing what you do.
Oh, that means a lot. Thank you.
Definitely.
Well, I think on that, this has been a great chat. Thank you for talking about the Wanderers Havamal and all these other things. We went on a few different good threads there. So thanks again.
Yeah, hopefully the Yggdrasil part didn't get too knotted up.
No, it was perfect.
This is our favorite type of thing to talk about. So and honestly, you're welcome on again anytime if you got other things coming up. We've really enjoyed this conversation. The last one we had was awesome as well, and looking forward to everything that you've got coming up.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it much. Thank you both.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Well, it was great having Dr. Crawford on the show. Thanks again to him for calling in and chatting with us. And I'll just throw it in here too as well. Thanks to Hackett Publishing for getting us in touch with him and letting us use their work to do our podcast.
Yeah, and we always have such a good time chatting with Dr. Crawford, so big thanks again for coming on the show. As you mentioned, Hackett Publishing, we really couldn't do the show without their support, or at least not in any similar form to what we have now. We wouldn't be able to use nearly as good of a resource with the Poetic Edda there. Being able to use his translation and with the support of Hackett, we're able to do the show in the form we do it today. So huge thanks to them. Really hope you enjoyed the interview as much as we did. Always a good time talking with Dr. Crawford there. So I think it's been a long afternoon and chatting with Dr. Crawford here. So I think I'm just about done for the day, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Before we go, if you'd like to support us, we have a Patreon. We're actually reworking it, so to get sort of a better idea of what things you get at various levels of support. Right now, at like $5 per episode, you're still going to get early access and all that kind of stuff, but we're hoping to do more. If you'd like to connect with us, we're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. All of the links are in the description. You can also email us at northernmythspodcast@gmail.com. And of course, a big shout out again to our friends at Grimfrost. They really are our favorite source of authentic Viking products and apparel inspired by Vikings and Norse mythology. Check out their website at grimfrost.com. There's something for everyone, especially if you like our show. And with that, I think that's about it. Unless, Luke, you have anything to add?
Well, Dan, there's only one thing left, to be honest, and first of all, that's to say a big thank you for joining us, and we hope that you find the myth that you're living. This has been the Northern Myths Podcast. Thanks for joining us.